Be seated. I feel as I've been gone for a good while, I just wonder how things went. You probably didn't miss me too much. You had some really good visiting officiants, didn't you, with Dina and with Margie?
The church is still standing.
The church is still
What's your
standing.
name again, Father?
No comments from you, Russell.
Did you miss us?
Yeah, I did. I really did, truly. I did not miss thinking about getting a sermon ready. I did not miss driving up and down the mountain, but I missed you. And I wanted so much for you to see some of the things I got to see. So if you'll just indulge me for just a few minutes, I just want to tell you a little bit about the trip, and then we'll get into the sermon, okay? Because I've got to get this out of my system as much as I can. First of all, I feel like I'm speaking from underwater because we just got back late Friday, and I really haven't had a good night's sleep yet. Much of our time was spent north of the Arctic Circle, so we were in Norway, for those of you who didn't know, Mary and I. And so I was not adjusting to sunlight throughout most of the night very well. And sleep still has not caught up with me. I'm really tired. But so thankful for such a trip. Unbelievable. We went all the way on an 11-day cruise up the coast of Norway from the south in Bergen all the way up to the Russian border right at Murmansk. And there we took a river boat. Those who indulged in that, not everybody on the ship did that, about 10 of us did it, took a river boat to the Russian border, to this remote outpost where they said, the Norwegian guide said, do not put your foot across that border. They are watching you, and you may not come back. So we were warned multiple times, don't do that. But our pictures are taken within 2 feet of the Russian border with the web. We know the web cameras were watching and everything. And the guide said, you can take a rock from the Norwegian side. So Mary, as if we didn't have enough luggage, we brought a rock from the top of Norway. And I guess over the years that rock will become more and more special. Oh my gosh, the excursions we took, hiking, bicycling. My favorite of all was a rib boat, an inflatable boat that took us into the strongest tidal current in the world. I guess it's twice a day. This area is just engulfed with a current that empties from the rivers into the ocean. And our rib boat pilot took us around through the swirling eddies of this vast expanse of churning water. It was just remarkable, with seagulls by the thousands hovering overhead because that swirl stirs up food from the bottom. And the gulls are feeding, people are fishing by the side and waving at you as your boat is crazily going around. And you're wondering if you're going to go sucking into the center of the earth. But oh, that was a thrill. I would do that again. We did other things, other excursions. But for me, one of the most enjoyable things was seeing the churches. The churches are absolutely beautiful, and unfortunately, they're also mostly empty. Not surprising what's taking place with churches around the world. But the history is rich, and the churches tell stories of ages past. We went into churches of the 1700s and 1800s, mostly wooden structures, and beautifully adorned inside. Always at every church, one thing was in common: the graveyards. At this time of year, there are flowers in Norway, so there were flowers at every gravestone, fresh flowers. I don't know who planted them, but I do know who kept them. At every church, there was always 1 or 2 elderly women with watering cans, and they were out watering the flowers. No matter what church we went to, nobody else was there, but the women were watering the graveyard flowers. I thought that might be kind of symbolic of the church in our time. And it's kind of a sad commentary on the state of the church, but yet it was touching to see their dedication. The cruise lasted 11 days, took us all the way above the Arctic Circle and then back down, and Mary and I got off in a beautiful city, the 3rd largest in Norway, called Trondheim. And there we rented a car, and this was the highlight of the trip. That was to journey into the lower portion of Norway which is if you know the geography at all of Norway, it's the lower portion that's kind of bulbous. It's big round area, whereas the upper portion is more slender like a tail. So we drove into the center, into the southern valleys, 500 miles in this rental car through the southern valleys to this small community called Tildalen. There is the history of Sogard Farm, Mary's ancestral farmland. Her family had owned that farm since the 1300s when the King of Sweden deeded it to the Sogards. S-O-G-A-A-R-D. In 1867, her great-great-grandfather, Swann Sogard, decided times were just too rough. And it was the poorest time in Norway, one of the poorest times. So he sold the farm in 1867 and inscribed in the barn, leaving the farm in good order, taking my family to America, April something, 1867, Swann Sogard. That inscription is still there. We were able to take a picture of it. It's very faint, but his handwriting is beautiful. It's just beautifully inscribed penmanship on the beam of the barn. And the barn has now been given by the purchaser's family to a local museum. So it's just sitting there in kind of perpetuity. Anyway, the interesting thing is the family who bought it wasn't named Sogard, but the practice at the time was when you purchase a piece of property, you take on the property's name. So now the great-great-granddaughter of the purchaser is Gunhild Sogard, and she welcomed us for 7 hours of conversation and hospitality on Sogard Farm. We had a tour of the farm, of the barn, and they went way up into the hills where they also had Sogard Farm goes, and that's where they used to take the cattle during summer months. They called it the summer farm. So I could tell you more and more about that, but the gist of it is we found the farm. That was the purpose of the tour. And we have more stories to tell and we could write a book about. So just so thankful for that. Then we concluded our tour by driving to Oslo, which is the largest city in Norway, a very international metropolitan city. We stayed there for 2 days, and it was also a wonderful experience, very different than the rest of the tour. And then we flew out and landed in LAX, which was the downfall of the entire 3 weeks. Yeah. It was the hardest part. There we were, toting way too much luggage, absolutely exhausted, and we had to figure out how to get from LAX back to Ukaipa. We did that by taking a bus to Union Station, a train from Union Station to San Bernardino Depot. Then we called an Uber driver who picked us up in a pickup and took us home. But anyway, that's why I'm tired.
Yeah.
Blame it on LAX.
Wow.
But thank God for such a tour. It made me very aware of our need to have roots, to have an origin, a beginning, a place that we can call our belonging. For Mary, I'm so pleased that she has this history now of Sogard Farm. But our church also has to have roots, don't we? We don't want to feel that we're just here by accident. We like to think that some story bigger than ourselves has somehow compelled us to join or affiliate with a certain church. So we're going to be talking for today and the next 3 Sundays about Anglican roots, basically, and Anglican practice, specifically Episcopal Anglican practice. And then by the time the bishop comes, Bishop Diane Bruce comes on September 15th, I would like for some of you to be comfortable to possibly do a reaffirmation of faith, or if somebody needs to be baptized or have a confirmation, we could do that too. If none of that takes place, I just want you to know more about your church, and when the bishop comes, if she asks you any questions about the church, you should be able to answer those questions. You've given me some things to answer, and I'll try those in the next 4 weeks. Today will be my most disorganized week. So first of all, many of you have come from Roman Catholic backgrounds, right? How many have come from Roman Catholic backgrounds? Most of you. That's fascinating. Yeah. So one of the most important things we need to accomplish over the next few weeks is to help you understand more of what you've gotten yourself into, okay? So that you can understand a little better what maybe is good about your decision to affiliate with the Episcopal Church. England is a very interesting place. I've never been there. Maybe that'll be my next journey because I find my roots, DNA-wise, are more in the British Isles, Welsh, and Scottish. So possibly I'll be heading over that way to look for Swann farm. Who knows? But I was thinking, how did England even come to be Christianized? And I did a little more research on it than I had done before. It was interesting to me. I didn't realize that there were two major forces really Christianizing England, which is an island, right? An island that didn't have easy access, no internet. You got to think of the isolation of a big island in the centuries past, not England as it is today. But the main influence of Christianity came from two directions. One was from the south, that is from Rome, from the south and the east, bringing Roman practice, Roman theology. And the other was Celtic Christianity, coming from the north, from Iona even, coming down by way of monks, missionary monks into the island of England, trying to Christianize this great isle. So in a way there was a battle for the soul of England as far as Christianity goes between the north and the south, and these influences of Rome versus Celtic tradition. Well, in about 694, I think that's the year, there was a synod called the Synod of Whitby. And in the synod in Northumbria, which is basically a big portion of England at the time, the decision was made to go with Rome rather than to go with the northern influence. So Rome won out, and Catholicism put its stamp, Roman Catholicism really put its stamp on England at that time. That went on for several centuries. And when the Reformation began with Martin Luther and others, who were some of his contemporaries? Anybody know?
Henry VIII.
Well, yeah, we're going to get to Henry VIII in just a minute. Calvin, Zwingli, Luther, those were kind of like the big three. Other names that you might have been familiar with are William Tyndale, who was the one who translated the Latin, the Bible into English. And there were others, but it really Calvin, Luther, and Zwingli were the biggies. They were leading the Continental Reformation, but England is an island, so its experience is totally different. In fact, it's an enigma what was going on in England at the time, because it was not in favor of, by and large, not supportive of the Reformation that was taking place under Luther's influence, largely because of Henry VIII. You may not have realized this, but Henry VIII was a staunch Catholic for a while. Until it suited, yeah. Until it inconvenienced him. So under his rule, there was little chance of Protestant Reformation making its inroads into England. Of course, then there was that problem with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who failed to produce a male heir. And this was a long-term problem for Henry because the whole Tudor dynasty had problems producing male heirs. In fact, it was a very weak dynasty as far as that goes. It was always on pins and needles whether it would even survive because they couldn't have the validity or the authority of a male line, which was so important at the time. So Henry, actually, as a Tudor monarch, was kind of on fragile ground in terms of his own authority. One way he could cement that is to have a male heir, right? I just need to have a boy. And Catherine, although they were married for 23 years, had multiple miscarriages. And so that's when the evolution of the relationship with Anne Boleyn took place. And eventually he petitioned the Pope to give him an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, who was, after all, his sister-in-law. Anybody know that part of the story? Yeah, his brother. I'm trying to get all the people right here in my mind.
She was the queen before he was king.
Right, but she was married to his brother.
Who was the king?
Right, and his brother died at an early age. His brother, I think his name was Arthur. King Arthur died at an early age. So then he married her, and they were married for 23 years. But he thought, that's a good grounds for an annulment. I shouldn't have married my sister-in-law. Well, the Pope wouldn't grant that annulment, long and story short, and so that's what was the personal factor that was behind the formation of the Act of Supremacy, which the Parliament passed, what was the year, I can't remember the exact, in the mid-1500s, the first Act of Supremacy, I think it was 38, which gave the king, the monarchy, and his successors absolute rule over the church. It's an interesting way of doing church, isn't it? Well, the problem with that was his daughter, King Henry VIII's daughter, who was Mary I, which was the only surviving child of his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. Mary I succeeded Henry VIII, and she was staunch Roman Catholic. So in a whiplash fashion to the people of England, she reverted them back to a staunch practice of Roman Catholicism. The Reformation that was beginning under Henry VIII's change to a state church was now jerked out from under the people of England, and now they were back to forced Catholicism. That lasted until Mary was no longer queen, and then Edward VI assumed the throne, a young king, and he brought Protestantism back. So you can imagine what's happening to the people of England during this time. Unlike in continental Europe, where Protestantism was kind of a more like a wildfire taking place, and the masses were embracing Protestantism, in England it was a very knee-jerk back and forth process between these changing of the monarchs. Under Edward VI, it began afresh, and then it was cemented as a state religion under the strength of Elizabeth I, who ruled for, I think, 45 years. It was a long reign. You've seen many movies, right, about Elizabeth I. Such a strong monarch, and again, the Act of Supremacy was passed by Parliament, a second Act of Supremacy, giving her authority as the governor of the church. And that act stands even today. So even up to today, the monarch is the governor of the church. They didn't call it the head of the church because that was too many problems with men and who did not want a female head. They could deal with a female governor, but the thought of a female head was just a little too much. So that's why she's called, or the monarch is called the governor, head governor, the governor of the church. That's some background in a really sloppy fashion, I apologize, but maybe that makes a little sense to you in terms of what Anglicanism was up against and just taking shape. During that period, a formative character was Thomas Cranmer, who was appointed to be Archbishop of Canterbury during Henry VIII's rule, and it was Thomas Cranmer who penned most of the first book of Common Prayer. If he didn't pen it, he borrowed it, he took it from Latin Rite. Like I said, I've gone blank. What's our Collect of Purity? The opening Collect of Purity. He didn't pen that. He borrowed that from a Latin Rite and he put it in to the first book of Common Prayer. But he was a genius at liturgy, Thomas Cranmer, and we owe so much to him. He was later burned at the stake by Bloody Mary, Mary I, which is also a difference. In continental Europe, nobody lost their head, or shouldn't say nobody, very few who opposed the Catholic Church were martyred for that. Luther wasn't. Zwingli was. Calvin wasn't. But in England, I think there were about 220 martyrs, mostly burned at the stake by Bloody Mary. And Thomas Cranmer was one of them. So Thomas Cranmer's blood is between these pages, which makes me appreciate this book. I appreciate it for so many reasons, but to think of the intellect and the faith of that particular man that helped pen this book that's in those pages. That seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? Mid-1500s. That was a really crazy time to be in England, the mid-1500s. But after that, things began to settle down somewhat, and really Anglicanism became the way of the church in England. And so by 1611, for instance, you have King James authorizing the writing of a Bible. Anybody know what that Bible's called? The King James Bible. Things had really settled down, so they wanted a Bible in the language of the people. And the King James Version became kind of the go-to version of the Bible. Even today, it's an authorized version in the Episcopal Church. The prayer book went up through several iterations as well over the years. And in some of our lifetimes, we've seen 2 iterations. What was the one before this one?
78.
Which year is this? 79.
79. 78.
Yeah, somewhere in there. What was I know why you're thinking 8. What was the one before that?
I have it. I can't remember the date.
1928.
Yeah, 28.
Any of us who are old-time Episcopalians, that would be before 1979, that would be me. We grew up on the 1928 version of the prayer book. It was a little bitty prayer book. I've got one in my office about that big. It's really written more in Old English, and it's a beautiful, beautiful prayer book, but it was not the language of the people in 1970s. So, and really it takes a long time to come up with a new version of the prayer book. I don't know exactly when they started, probably in the 60s, to come up with a version that was ratified in 1979. There will probably be another version within many of our lifetimes. So what do you think would be some of the issues that might be addressed in a new version of the prayer book? Gender, yeah.
Yeah, gender.
Yeah, it's already
More
changed.
gender-inclusive language, rights of marriage.
Right.
For instance, right now, the right of marriage is pretty exclusive between man and woman. That might be changed in another version of the prayer book. But mainly it would be gender-inclusive language. That would be one of the biggest things.
Slavery.
So what?
Slavery.
Slavery? I don't know. But that's a whole other issue we could look at sometime about the issue of slavery. We are incriminated with slavery in the Episcopal Church. And a lot of the current social justice emphasis in the church, I think, is a reaction to our guilt and our sense of responsibility over our involvement in a slave past. Anyway, do look for another version of this if you live another, what? Take a guess, how many more years?
50.
I bet you within 20 years. I'd say 10 to 20 years there'll be another version of the prayer book. I personally don't want another version. It took a lot to adapt to this one. So
Some haven't yet.
some haven't yet. I mean, it's a big deal. You lose people. But we talk about changes in the church, and when you lose people, one way you lose people is to change things they're accustomed to. Even if they don't have a good reason, they leave. Maybe they have good reasons, but people don't like that one word, and it's called change.
Right.
So.
And tradition.
And tradition, yeah, changes in tradition. I didn't address the scriptures at all today, but I wanted to talk for just a minute before I close today's little session with a thought about the difference between faith and belief. We had a great passage here in Hebrews 11 about faith and the heroes of faith, examples of great faith. When I went through Norway and I saw these empty churches, I can't say they were empty because I was never there for one on a Sunday, so it's not fair of me to say that. They appear to be a lot more church than there are potential people. That's all I can say. But there is the sense that faith in Norway, as faith in England might be, was largely a result of a state-imposed faith. In Norway, the church is the Church of Norway, and it's primarily, anybody know what denomination?
Lutheran?
Lutheran, yeah, it's primarily 75% of the country is Lutheran. So that's really interesting. And a very small portion is Catholic. And there are 4 Anglican churches. I checked on that.
4.
4 Anglican churches, totaling about 1,500 people, I guess. Anyway, when the state imposes religion, what does that do to faith? Doesn't cultivate it, does it?
No.
So that's largely what's happened in England. You've got a state-imposed religion. That's largely what's happened in Norway. You've got a state-imposed religion. In fact, in Norway, you are considered a member of the Church of Norway unless you opt out. You have to opt out, I think, by age 18, otherwise you're on the books. So that's why it looks like there are a lot of people in church, but in fact, there are not that many people in church. Statistically, 75% of the country is Church of Norway. On any given Sunday, probably 10% of the population's in church. So that tells you a whole lot. It's so important that we have not only belief, but that we have faith. We can believe things, but without faith, there is no church. And Thomas Cranmer's True Hope, one of his best homilies, was about the imperative to have a true and lively faith. That's one of the gifts that he wanted to give to the church, was to make a distinction between faith that is a dead faith versus faith that is a living faith. And a faith that's a living faith, he would say, is a faith that is grounded in the love of Christ. And it's grounded in the work of Christ. And it's evidenced through a life of good fruits. So he would say, you couldn't have a faith that had no good works. Your works would demonstrate that you have faith, but your works are not faith. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Your works flow out of your faith, but your faith is not proven by your works. He wanted us to have a true and lively faith, not just belief. It's really easy to have a church where you just people say, well, what does the Episcopal Church believe? And we'll talk about that some, okay? We'll get into that in future weeks. But I could tell you all day long what we believe, and we'd still have a dead church. Thomas Cranmer and other reformers would say, go beyond belief to the action of faith. Because without faith, the church is dead. Faith is an action, whereas belief is more of a thought. Thought and opinion are important, but they don't mean anything if we don't act out something. One of the most important things that our church is acting out these days is an inclusion of all people. And I don't know where that's written in any of the tenets of our church except in our baptismal covenant, where we say we will honor the dignity of every person, right? But it's one of the most pressing things that I see in the Episcopal Church. The most emphatic things that our bishops talk about is the inclusion of all people. We'll talk about that more in coming weeks, how that works out, but I think that's an important way that our belief takes action. I think I'm going to close for today. I realize that I'm very tired, probably speaking through a glass bubble. But I did want to set the stage for the next 3 weeks, and that is we'll talk more about the beliefs of the church and how we practice an act of faith. And if I don't answer your specific questions that you raised the other day, please let me know. Carol asked one I know that I want to address, and that was about liturgical gestures and things that we do that good Episcopalians used to do that we don't do anymore. So I'll talk about that. I hope this made some sense. I hope you learned a little bit about the formation of the Anglican Church. And isn't it interesting that we came out of such a mess? I mean, when you think about it, our DNA is from a guy who had 6 wives and beheaded a few of them. And here we are worshiping Christ. It just doesn't make sense, but here we are. So let's find out more about this great communion and this great church, and we'll see that it goes way beyond Henry VIII. We'll find out that there's a great strength to this denomination that will endure, I think, over the years to come. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for the love of God in our lives, and that you take even the foibles among us, our brokenness, our sin, and you make us a new people. We thank you for this church, the Episcopal Church, and ask that we would also learn to be exhibitors of your great faith. In Jesus' name. Amen.